deliver a response. It's factual, but it's factual couched in a way that has a particular interest. So it's factual, but is it factual by itself, or is factual leaning to fiction because of the effect? So we also throw in another question: fact, fiction. What are the effects of either? Because ultimately we live in a world of a cause and effect. So what is the effect of a fact, and what is the effect of a fiction? And perhaps what we actually need to worry about, in addition, is what are the effects of believing in certain facts, and what are the effects of believing in certain fiction. Because not all fictions are bad, and so on and so. This is just to take your opening gambit and just to formatize it a little bit.
All right. Okay. Let's put that in the those those tempt you into coloring facts. Yeah. So when you boil it down from the perspective of journalism, old fashioned, good old fashioned journalism, good old fashioned journalism is about facts: who, what, where, when, how much. And even the question of why, we tended to stay away from why, because that you're getting into interpretation. And if you want to wade into interpretation, you might want to talk to specialists so you can quote specialists. So it's not your opinion where you get the opportunity, where you might sort of color the facts. So that's as far as from a point of view, from the perspective of journalism, is sort of putting out the news as fact versus fiction in the orthodox sort of definition or meaning of fiction as we know it, which is just something a writer, an author creates, makes up, quite frankly, right? Am I making sense, Ato?
Fact as truth. And I like how you describe the news agency, the mandate. So just reduce everything to the barest minimum that can be verified.
Correct.
So journalism as truthful, and fiction as somehow untruthful, because there's that implicit there. And in fact, most ordinary people assume that fiction is a form of untruth. However, that that stylization of uh, journalism slash fact versus fiction, which it might be considered to be unfactual, is not entirely accurate because first of all, many fictions draw on historical factual ideas. Let me take a really good example that I think many people will recognize in our audience. You know the film The Woman with It, the one about the Dahomeyans,
Yes.
Agugi, they're called. I watched it a couple of weeks ago, and I actually wrote something about it on Facebook. And I started off by saying that to require Hollywood to be historically accurate is like asking a fish to prove its earnestness by riding a bicycle. I mean, the requirement that Hollywood be entirely historically accurate is like asking a fish to ride a bicycle. It's completely ridiculous. You cannot ask Hollywood to be true in that sense. However, at the same time, the film has a lot of truth, even factual truth, and also truth of historical processes. The film itself was obviously drawing on certain documents, but the way it set itself up as entertainment. The historical figures who were living in that historical moment, they were not historical actors for entertainment reasons. So King Gezu and the head of the Agoji and so on. They were not entertaining anybody. They were living a life of war. So by definition, the film has distorted the historical. It has converted history into entertainment. However, I also said that there, notwithstanding that, there are lots of truthful, factually truthful, but also processually truthful aspects to the film, so that we cannot just dismiss it. For example, in the film they refer to palm oil production. There's a whole section where they actually go to palm oil plantation. The date of the film it starts in 1823. Now, 1823 is really important because abolition was 1807. But slavery did not end after abolition. And there are various reasons, but what is most pertinent to the film is that even though the British set up a naval fleet to seize a slave cargo from ships, they signed a treaty with Portugal to allow only Portugal to continue slaving in 1810. So 1807 they abolished slavery, but 1810 they signed a treaty with Portugal to allow them to continue slavery. And there are lots of reasons for this very cynical, political calculation. Now, in the film, the reference to palm oil plantation is historically very salient because in the conversion or transformation of slave economies into what historians call the gentleman's trade, they had to find new means of generating economic wealth. And one of the most important was coffee and palm oil. In fact, palm oil was much bigger. Coffee failed in West Africa. So when the film points to palm oil production, it is actually telling us that in the historical transition from slavery, which did not end all of a sudden, many West African economies were struggling with alternative sources of wealth. Now, this is a historical fact. And it is not a historical fact, it is a fact of historical transition, which was very fraught. It was debated. I mean, very many economies in West Africa, the Igbos, there were big debates about shall we suck the wealth that it generated from the trade in humans to wealth that this conversion of us into peasants. There's a point in the film where one of the wives of the king says the woman wants to turn us into peasants, and no one is afraid of a peasant. This is really important. That the peasantization of the West Africa following the demise of all these are historical facts. One more thing which was very fascinating to me, and Kwaku, you will understand why. The way the people were dressed in the film, there were lots of beautiful, African tie and dye, but the fabrics for the cloth that especially the women were wearing was hand woven, and there are scenes in the film where they show them with the African looms weaving the cloth, more than one. And then there's also an explicit reference to indigo dye. They're making a big cauldron of indigo dye. And so much of the film is a celebration of African-made cloth and African-made garments and fabric. Except for one really important detail, and this is also historically true. The king changed his, he was acted by John Boyega. He changed his attire several times in the film. But many of the things he wore were not of local production. They were not indigenous fabrics. They were silk. He wore silk gowns with different kinds of prints and so on. This is also historically very salient because the ruling elites in West Africa were the first to adopt Western material goods. So they took, for example, out whiskey. Who started drinking whiskey first? The chiefs and the traders started drinking whiskey first, started wearing silk as a mark of distinct. So the film is accurate in that respect. The ordinary people wore locally locally manufactured garments and fabric, but the ruling elites wore European garments. In fact, we may even stretch the matter a little bit further to say that it is on the arrival in West Africa of what we commonly call blissful, which is factory manufactured cotton. So factory manufactured cotton with all kinds of colorful prints. We call them African print cloth. But they're actually not African print cloth. They were not African. They were the viscose set started in 1848. It was the arrival of factory manufactured cotton that destroyed our local economy of fabric making. And the film hints at this. So the film is fictional, clearly. But there are lots of factual elements. It would be a wonderful film for discussing not just the obvious resistance to slavery and so on, but the different modes of historical transition. So that's what I want to say, that the assumption that fiction is a lie and fact is fact is not entirely accurate.
Well, what you've said is entirely accurate. And I completely agree with you. In fact, as you would know, there's there's a whole genre of literature that is factional, a combination of fiction and fact. And what you've described so vividly and eloquently, and by the way, I'm yet to see Agoji, and I was just talking about it a moment ago with a couple of friends of mine who are in the audience now, that I must go and see it with Georgette, and if you were here, we would go together. So I'll go and see it and also read your review, about which there's been quite a lot of review, by the way. But yes, faction or factional literature, that will fall into that category. And there are a few more actually. Roots by Alex Haley is factional, because obviously it's based on the historical facts of slavery, but featuring fictional situations, characters, or should I say fictional characters who depict factual narratives of what things that actually did happen. Or even Chimamanda's Half a Yellow Sun, which is based on the Biafra War, or the Titanic. So this is a whole genre that I actually do find very interesting. Having said that and having agreed on that, and I'd like to hear some of the thoughts of the audience on that as well. Oh, by the way, there's also autobiographies or biographies that where the author kind of to protect the identities of certain individuals and so on and so forth are sometimes factional as well. Yeah. And to transition back to journalism, you also know that, say, in the 70s in Ghana, 70s, 80s, the era of military rule, where fundamental freedoms were not guaranteed. So we had opinion writers, columnists, journalists who wrote about the situation in the country at the time under pseudonyms and made references to political leaders without naming them, but which readers, whose identities readers deciphered anyway. So, for example, Professor Kwesi Yanka, even though his identity wasn't revealed at the time, when he wrote Abunsam Fireman in the 1970s, in the Christian Messenger, so he talked about some of the difficulties in those days, and one of the characters in Abunsam Fireman was Kontupiat, which was a reference to Kutu Achampong, and there were other characters in it like that. People wondered who was the author. We found out much later, in fact, people initially thought it was Professor Paul Ansah who was the author, but it wasn't. It was 27-year-old Professor Kwesi. Well, at the time, he wasn't a professor. He went on to greater academic laurels subsequently. But he was the author of Abunsam Fireman. But he subsequently, in the mid-80s, when he returned from earning his PhD, I believe, at Indiana University, came to write another column, begin and write another column called The Woes of a Patriot, where he referred to he had a character in it called his Jerry Ship. Of course, Jerry Rawlings was president at the time. Independent newspapers were not permitted. And so he ran sort of political commentary through political, social, and economic commentary through Woes of a Patriot, where this character, his Jerry Ship, featured prominently. In fact, my first job, actually, before I worked on the Ghana News Agency, was for a newspaper called Sports Guide, which subsequently has metamorphosed into the Daily Guide of today. But it was Sports Guide because political newspapers were not permitted, but sports papers were. And so my friend and classmate, and at the time, my boss, Kwabna Yeboah, sports journalist, had a newspaper when we were in journalism school called Sports and Lotto. So sports and lotto forecasting was permitted. You could publish sports analysis, sports news, and forecast the lottery. So he combined the two and had sports and lotto. But he became the editor of the sports guide. And there was a column hidden in the sports guide, which was political. It was hidden, buried in the back page, written by Freddie Blay. Self-same Freddie Blay, until recently chairman of the NPP, and now whose chambers are defending a few people, Chinese citizens that have been charged with illegal small-scale mining. Self-same Freddie Blay. But anyway, but the point is about that column, which was political, but wrapped in sports guide. So yes, there's also journalism of that nature. But there's another kind of journalism where the journalist try to hide fiction and pass it off as journalism. In the States, a gentleman called, I think, Jason, the surname escapes me for a moment. I'll look it up. But anyway, he worked for the New York Times and published several supposed news stories, but which were completely fiction, and managed to pass this through, fooled the editors, managing editors, and of course in the end he was fired along with his superiors in I believe 2005 or so, and brought the good name of a 152-year-old newspaper into disrepute. So there's that. I'll say this and then I'll shut up and have you jump in. You know, sometimes when you read factual stuff, including autobiographies, which I love, some autobiographies are so fantastical that you couldn't have created them. Not even you, Ato. In spite of all the books behind you. By the way, you know, he's one of my favorite human beings. I call him owner of book. Woloche. Engumaura. I don't know how you say that in Hausa. Somebody help me. Any Hausa here? Or Dagomba? Sorry? May Ilimin. Atuya May Ilimin. Owner of book. Anyway, take Mike Tyson's autobiography. Big fat, I think it's like 900 pages. And if you haven't read it, you should. You know, full of swear words. But it's a story of a guy that comes from absolutely, I mean, worse than nothing. Were together with he didn't know who his father was, but together with his mother, who did the most horrible things you could ever imagine. They lived in slimy, abundant places, including in winter. Was a petty thief. Would climb into people, the roofs of people's houses. He was so small he could sneak through slits in the walls. To eventually become a wealthy man worth $600 million at a point. Had mansions, one of which had 9 kitchens, and on his 30th birthday had catering in each of those 9 different kitchens, a different kind of cuisine from different continents, 19 bedrooms with 19 women waiting for him. By the way, his wife wasn't invited to the party. But got so broke that at the lowest point of his life, he had Rice Krispies for dinner. And someone stole his credit card. The balance was not enough when the gentleman tried to use it to pay for a cab for dinner, a little takeaway at a curbside eatery. The balance was not enough. Now, this is not fiction. This is not fiction. So, what was it that Martin said at the beginning? That what was it again about fact and fiction? That some fiction isn't as good, stranger than fiction. Now that is stranger than fiction. I'm shutting up. Ato, take it. We can't hear you, Ato.
I have done nothing. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can now.
Okay. I think I have to wave my hand magically, and then the voice, the fact fiction.
That's how some avatars work. That's how avatars.
Walk, take your throttle to the library to get the New York Times and then read it in the library because you don't take it out and then fact check everything and so on and so forth. Now we are all up to our children, even 5-year-olds know how to do it. However, after the 2020 elections in the United States, it has now emerged that the conspiracy theories, and there are many quite outrageous conspiracy theories going on, are actually, as it were, confirmed in their ideas because of the algorithm. And used in
I'm sorry, we it's incredible. And I think just as incredible are some of the things that we saw circulating on the internet, especially in the course of the pandemic. The supposed role of 5G. I mean, the speed of the internet was supposed to have, germinated this virus. And the substantial number of people who believe it. So when we're at an interesting time where the internet is concerned with regard to fact. What's fact and what's fiction? I'll throw this in as well. In 2000, and this back to journalism. In 2005, newspapers in Ghana published as a headline, a story about a Ghanaian, a 30-year-old Ghanaian called Kwaku Sakyi Addo. The headline, by the way, was that was IGP's son a terrorist. I think those that were a little careful, excuse me, used a question mark to sort of hopefully protect themselves. And there was a story about the IGP at the time was Dr. KK Mafu. He had a son called Kwaku Sakyi Addo. He was 30 years old and he lived in London. He hadn't heard from him in a while. The police made an arrest of a gentleman involved in a bombing. And the gentleman's name, according to the police, was Kwaku Sakyi Addo. Citizenship Ghanaian, age 30. So of course the assumption by the journalists was that that was the IGP's son, when he confirmed upon inquiry that yes, he had a son by those three names. He was 30, he lived in London and was a Ghanaian citizen. I worked for Reuters at the time. And, you know, we didn't make that assumption that it was his son. Is Ato Quayson back?
Yes, I have really good news. First, the Ghanaians have won this round. A message from him. I think the problem is from my end. My internet dropped all of a sudden. So now he's back.
All right. Okay, so Ato, could you hear me or not? You can hear me now. Okay, I'm going to finish. I'm going to finish this story quickly so that you can carry on. So anyway, it turns out that the Kwaku Sakyi Addo Mafu, 30 years old, living in London, Ghanaian citizen, was not Dr. KK Mafu's son. His ID was stolen in a burglary by a gentleman, so that in fact when the culprit's mug shot was circulated, Dr. Mafu says, but that's not my son. It was a gentleman of Somali or East African origin and who had stolen Sakyi Addo Mafu's ID and had it on him when he was arrested upon committing the crime. Something especially for journalists to think about, and where fiction and fact can get all overlapping. Back to you, Ato. I'll tell you this story when you come to Ghana offline.
I'll remind you. I was talking about the fact fiction divide and how now it's getting another problem is emerging, which is because we are so dependent on the internet for our sources of information. Even a 5-year-old know how to Google automatically. What has happened and have become clear since the disputed American 2020 election is that various conspiracy theory groups are confirmed in their conspiracy theory beliefs through the algorithms by which things like Google, Facebook, Instagram identify their interests. So when you, for example, say Facebook, there's often things pop up on Facebook. If you hover, it turns out that if you delay on an image, the algorithm picks that image. So it's an advertising. You're not interested in buying anything, but you slow down to look at it. They add it to things that you might be interested in. So, for example, because of my coconut head, I love hats. So anytime I see an image, the image of a hat, I look at it. Even when I'm going to buy it, it doesn't matter. I look at it. And so I get more images of hats. I'm always on my feed. Hats are always appearing. Even though I looked at it just once. Once I looked at a Viking bracelet, just in passing. All of a sudden, they were trying to sell me Viking bracelet. The point of it is that these algorithms are now creating enclaves of not just beliefs, but misinformation. And depending on your enclave, conspiracy theory enclave, everything that you believe that is false will be confirmed because you get more and more facts and interpretations which will emphasize that mode of unbelief. And so, amazingly, even though we were all watching the same results for the 2020 American election, there are people who swear by their mother and grandmother that the thing was stolen by Biden. And they can point to news items and opinions on the internet. Therefore, it raises another question, and this one is actually of profound significance. How is it that facts from a source that we all rely on, which is the internet, how can facts so distort people's opinions that something as profound as a democratic process can become a source of such contention and disagreement? So the fact versus fiction thing enters another tier of problem, because in fact, what we are seeing is facts that are algorithmically designed to confirm bias. So they are bias confirming facts. And the bias confirming facts are generated by the algorithms of from what you look at, you pause on the news site that you visit. And so you can have your neighbor both watching the same election and the same results are coming out, but the two of you will have completely different opinions. And this is what is dividing America. And America is one of the most, it's a very, very fascinating place, I must say. It's very, very fascinating, but it's also fascinating for the extremes of bias that you find in this country. And these biases are confirmed by the social media, internet, and so on.
That's a fascinating perspective. By the way, do we all know about the, well, I'm sure many of us would, about the Kennedy Lincoln story? Is that fact or fiction? That, you know, JFK is some kind of sort of, yeah, the resurrection, if you like, of Lincoln, and those facts. I'm sure you can find it about Lincoln's vice president being Andrew Jackson, and Kennedy's vice president Andrew Johnson and Lyndon Johnson, right? And Lyndon Johnson, I think, has 13 letters, and Andrew Jackson as well, 13 letters, and Lincoln being shot in a theater and running into, where did he run to? Well, somewhere, but on the other hand, Kennedy, it was the assassin who shot Kennedy, fled into a theater, and the gentleman that shot Lincoln fled from a theater, and so on. And the dates of birth of Lyndon Johnson and Andrew Johnson and so on and so forth. I mean, is that fact or fiction? Apparently, it's fact. Yes.
Another dimension of this, bias confirmation. You know that there are people in this country who believe that some of these shootings, park side school shooting and Sandy Hook.
Yes.
The big new Sandy Hook.
Alex Jones.
Alex Jones. They actually believe, along with Alex Jones, that these were staged. That the shootings were people died, but it was staged by government agents. And amazingly, people believe it is true that it was staged. So the people the families have taken Alex Jones to court, and we know he's been fined upwards of $960 million. And so there are people right now as we speak, he's fundraising, and there are people believing in his innocence and believing in his conspiracy theory who are contributing to his fund so he gets out of this hole. It's but there is a confirmation bias or bias. The compilation of bias produced by an algorithm. Is this fact or is this fiction? How much fact checking do we require to apply to this source, this go-to source of information, which is the internet? It's very, very worrying.
Yeah, I completely agree, Ato. It's have you considered, what happened with Alex Jones and the info wars? I mean, this guy made just falsehood and lying, made a cottage industry out of it, and indeed many people are doing so. And he says the families of the victims were just actors. You had situations where people went and urinated on the graves of the children that had been killed because they'd been made to believe that it was all a hoax. Meanwhile, this guy was pocketing like $1 million a day. And now he's fundraising and people are contributing to it. I don't know what the world is coming to, and I don't know. We've got 10 minutes to end. and Q&A. Okay, yeah. So yes, I think this is a great time to have some Q&A. Yes, sir.
Very interesting discussion. My name is Nyaye. Kwaku, you had the privilege of interviewing Jerry Rollins as his last interview before he died. He said a couple of things, which I think that in a couple of years, that interview that you had it in 2 parts are going to be very relevant. For instance, he tells a story about how a close friend of his mixed, claimed that he had mixed cement for somebody to drink. After that interview, that supposed friend wrote a very scathing article denying that he said that Jerry Rollins had mixed the cement. I want to ask you if post that interview you have fact-checked Jerry Rollins.
You know, as a Jerry Rollins says that this gentleman mixed cement for another to drink. The gentleman says he didn't. I haven't found anyone who's corroborated Jerry Rawlings' account. But one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to Jerry Rawlings was that so much had been said about what he had done, allegedly. But we'd never heard from him himself what his own account of those allegations were. My purpose was not to establish fact, but to hear his version and leave people to decide what they chose. So it was good that this gentleman also put out his version and denied it. Jerry Rawlings since died. What's the truth? What are the facts? Is it fiction? We'll probably never know. No. So it's entirely up to the audience. So yeah. By the way, I also interviewed Dr. Hila Liman shortly before he died. Be careful, you know. Don't ask me for an interview if you wanna live for a very long time.
Thank you.
Yes.
Quick, a question here.
Yes, Prince.
Since I know you, and I know you are one of the finest journalists we know. As an average Ghanaian, you know, we are talking about fact versus fiction. Now, we don't have the opportunity to be on the ground to have access to first-hand data. But you, the journalists, who are the ones who give us the information, how do we then, since there's so many different layers to news and information, as Professor Ato Quayson said, right now you don't even know fact from fiction. How do we then decipher what is true and what is not true? Because, you know, we can talk about everything, but in the end, we are the end readers.
Yeah.
And if we are not able to decipher the truth, then should we continue reading, or should we continue in this search of knowledge or information? And that's to you. And for Professor Ato Quayson, I wanted to ask him, because he's a writer and a lecturer also. This can be a bit of a dicey one. I know the Bible. I don't know if you are religious or not, Prof. But with the Bible, I know whenever, you know, there's discussion on the Bible, especially in this part of the world, it's always said, as you see it, you take it like that. And some people call it dogma. So in the Bible, I know in some parts, you know, I think there was the story of Jesus feeding the people. Some people said it was with 2 loaves of bread and 3 fishes, or vice versa. Somebody in another part of the Bible, it was 7 or 5 or whatever. I just want to, you know, kind of like use that as an example to today's, you know, to current situations where somebody will say, no, this is what happened. Another person will say, this is what happened. And I guess depending on the angle, what would you say that people should consider as the true information, and what you think, in quotes, people should consider as not true information? Thank you.
Ato, you go first.
for
Any religious person will tell you that the question of truth versus falsehood is not the most important question to pursue when it comes to the Bible. It's a question of faith. And the Bible is filled with allegories and parables that are designed to induce faith. Now, how I read the Bible, and the Bible is a fundamental document for literary studies all over Europe, not just in English, French, Spanish, because it has impacted on the ideational, the level of ideas and images. The Bible is so fundamental to writers like Shakespeare, Gugi wa Thiong'o. Gugi wa Thiong'o is one of the most Christian, not in terms of his belief system, but in terms of the images he uses in his novels. Achebe also. So, but the way I see the Bible is that, and some theologians will likely disagree with me, is that it's a collection of oral storytelling. The Bible, whether it's Old Testament or New Testament, is oral storytelling, which was then put into writing. Now, anyone who has studied orality knows that orality is full of different features. It's full of wise sayings. It's full of songs. But it's also full of contradictions. But the fact that the oral story has contradictions does not mean that it is trying to purvey untruthfulness. That's not the question. When you're listening to an Anansi story, you are not asking whether the Anansi story is true or false. You are trying to extract a meaning out of it, sometimes useful for the conduct of morality and so on. So the question of is it true, factually true or not, I don't think that's the most pressing question for people who believe. Believers in the Bible, I think very few believers in the Bible would believe mechanically on the basis of truth or falsehood. The stories resolute. They are lesson bearing, and they are lesson bearing beyond the context in which they were produced. We are not under the impress of ancient Rome. We are not like the early Christians, because Christianity started under the Roman Empire. The letters to the epistles, so the epistles, the Pauline epistles to the Corinthians. The Corinthians were an early Christian community that was frankly confused and bewildered. We are not who they are, clearly. But the letters to the epistles speak of some universal truths that Christians think is useful, whether you were a Corinthian or not. The thing about love, about I was a child, but now that I'm older, this is what I believe in. It's of universal value. So that's how I would answer it. I myself, I think the Bible as a source of great literary value. This quite amazing thing. Listen to this. This is one of my favorite things. I think it's Esther and Ruth. If I'm not getting the name. Where you go, I will go. Your God will be your God, my God, and your people shall be my people. What beauty is this? Wherever you go, I will go. Your God will be my God, and your people shall be my people. It doesn't matter whether you are a believer in the Bible or not. This has resonance about love, about companionship, about friendship, about sacrifice. That goes beyond the biblical story.
Mics are not working. Okay.
Okay, there we go. Thank you very much. I've recently been reading a fair amount of Octavia Butler, and I found her work really interesting, and it's predictive, ability to predict the future, right? You know, she wrote in the 80s, 70s, and my daughter even recently said to me how how much she wished she was still alive because she wanted, she would have loved to meet her. And I think just her ability to help us understand our own personal human situation. And so I think, again, the fact that she was almost prophetic in what she wrote about, in terms of what we're seeing happening right now in the US and perhaps globally. But also, again, just generally thinking about fiction and what you just mentioned related to the Bible, and just understanding who we are and our situation, and how important that is, and how that in fact is fact in a way. So fiction's ability to help us understand who we are.
Which author?
Octavia Butler. So yeah, Parable of the Talents, and then the Dawn series is, yeah.
To take it.
I am not properly calculated in Butler, but I do know that literature, literary writing, bears the truth of feeling.
So so for example, if you ever want to write the history of jealousy, you are not going to go to history books cannot tell you enough about jealousy or indeed love. How do you understand what love is? The way to understand what love is by reading literature, because literature works or draws inspiration from the domain of ephemeral emotions and sentiments. So even though the context, the conditions may be fictional, the feelings that are captured will sound or ring true, and they can also be used as it were template for understanding your own life. I've said somewhere I ran a YouTube series for a while during lockdown, and in the intro to the series, I said that literature gives us moral vitamins. But as in the case of real vitamins, you have to take it often and consistently. You don't take your vitamins on Monday and then wait until Sunday before you take them again. For them to have effect, you have to take them always. For literature to have the effect of moral fine-tuning of your emotions, your sentiments, and your moral worldview, you have to read lots of it. To your Butler is important, but there are also other. So the more diversely and widely you read, the better, because the domain of feeling, of emotion, of things like love, jealousy, hatred, fear, anxiety, they are best understood through literature.
Yes, so we will have to bring the
sorry.
Q&A section to an end. Yes, and so maybe a few final comments before we wind up for today.
Yeah, I wanted to say something briefly about in response to Prince's question about just where to go to find the truth or to get your facts. Now back to just reality is, I think that the role of journalists, good old-fashioned journalists, has never been more important than today, than it is or ought to be today. Unembellished, shorn of adjectives and tantrums. Just give me the facts as you've confirmed them. Leave me to make up my mind. Respect me. And so I think, it's all a question of where you go to get your information, because that, as Ato pointed out, If you keep going to InfoWars, you'll be fed more Alex Jones trash. And I think that the space is increasingly decreasing, shrinking, for where to go for just unadorned, unembellished, factual news without all of the editorializing, even by presenters. And that's becoming increasingly mainstream in especially in the United States. You know, and it's a bad culture in my view. I choose to go where just the bare facts are told. That's where I go to look for my information. If I want fiction, if I want to embellish, I can do that myself. The last point is about the Bible, and actually I have that noted. Is the virgin birth fact or fiction? Is the resurrection fact or fiction? Is the story or promise of 7 maidens with, you know, lovely, beautiful breasts awaiting those who indulge in jihad? Is that fact or fiction? I don't know. But I think that's a really, excuse me, my voice, really important point that Ato makes. And the analogy is with some of the stories, folk tales that we, traditional folk tales, that you don't go to the stream or to sea or to farm on certain days of the week. And that if you did go to the stream on a certain day, you would be taken away by a dwarf. Well, the effect of those quote-unquote myths was that they did result in actual positive outcomes of an environmental nature. So that's the analogy with the lessons, the morals that are picked from those biblical and I believe other books of faith that people of faith believe and take to heart. That, I suppose, is the essence of some of our folk tales as well. Not whether they are fiction or fact, but what were the outcomes and how did they impact communities. And in many cases, they were positive.
Well, thank you so very much. That was a brilliant summing up. I don't have to do more. Well, there's one particular thing I can say for sure. Professor Ato Quayson and Mr. Kwaku Sakyi Addo actually did have this conversation at Peja, and that is a fact. So many thanks to you. And let me just remind you of the upcoming sessions. There is a movie that is going to be showing, it's actually starting about now. It's Talking Black in America. And it's a movie that investigates the nature of the spoken language to the racial situation in America, especially as it comes from the black community. This is showing at FCA right now. If you'd like to join the shuttle, please talk to the front desk, and there's a shuttle that will be moving from here to FCA. It's at no cost to you. Apart from that, the next event will have a reading. It's from the anthology Choboi, and that is happening, if I can see properly, in the library. There's also a reading, a discussion about the Ever Book of the Year. and then a reading with Mami Blue from Bad Love, and then you can hear some music already. That's because there's a performance session, Liberating Pleasures. And this is a discussion with the drama queens and Nana Dakoa Sichiama. Thank you very, very much.
And can I have a last word?
Yes, please.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you for spending your time with us. Thanks to the organizers for putting this together. Thank you very much that you create this oasis in all this chaos out there. And thanks, I believe I can say thanks on your behalf, Ato, right? Yes? Yes, I can. Yes. So I just wanted to say thank you.
Just a little correction. Our book of the year, even though it's fully online, you can join the session at the library. Yes, and then the reading with Mami Blue from her novel Bad Love is happening in Berlin. Okay, thank you. Enjoy the rest of the evening.